I guess we're not right now.
Huh?
I just noticed it right now.
I gave you one job. Okay, I don't know how long the camera's been off, but we were talking about, you know, certain entries and the way that you define certain entries, and you may write things, you know, kind of the same way. So right here, let me see if it'll do it. No, it's not going back. Sometimes if you do too many strokes or whatever, it won't. See if it puts it. So you define it there. It already knows once you global it, it's pretty much knows what it thinks you want it to do. And it is the comma. That's the way you would define it, with the brackets, comma. It already knows. You press number 1, enter. It already goes there. On this one, what they were wanting to do, oh yes. Let's see if it gives the option. Let's see if Couldn't be kidding. It doesn't give you the option. Well, what they were trying to do there was, I think, parentheses is what they do. I don't stroke it like that, but whatever. So, you know, it's bracket, paren, bracket. It already knows. So if you do paren, and you did it once, it's going to know that you're probably going to need to close it again. So you do it this way. I believe that was the way they defined it. You don't have to do it both ways. It already knows on an open paren and a closed paren. Does that make sense? So they know if you put one, another one's coming to close it. So if you did it again, then they're going to turn it around and do it the other way. Does that make sense? You want that in your main dictionary, so it does it. But they didn't do it. They didn't do. Well, you have to stroke it again. Is what it's doing here. You have to do it twice, because you stroke it once, then you put whatever you want in parentheses, then you have to do paren again, so that it knows to close the parentheses. I think they were just kind of doing that in the beginning, and they didn't do it twice. So let me see. Bless you. Bless you. Let's see if it knows. See, it doesn't know the dashes. So you do the shift, brackets, dash, close bracket. You want it in your main, it already knows. Put the space in between, it puts the 2 dashes, it already knows how to do it. Make sense? Okay.
Is it always 2? Is it always 2?
On dashes?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's always 2.
If they're cutting off their thought.
Right.
If you're cutting off a certain thought and it's like, well, I was gonna go, sorry, and it's in between a sentence, that's when you would use the dashes. That make sense? All right. And here, this is just the answers to the exercise that they were doing before. See, and that's how they defined it. See how they defined it right here? It already knows to do the one paren. So it knows the open and the close. But you have to stroke it twice, because if not, then it doesn't know. It only knows, you know, what it's doing. So you stroke it once, it's always going to put the first one. Then, you know, if you were going to put a, you know, reporter's note in parentheses, then you would have to write paren again, and it would know to put the paren on the other side here, the closed paren. Make sense? All right.
And that works with all of them, like the dash, you don't have to put the second dash.
You don't have to put any of that stuff. You don't have to put the spaces, none of that stuff. Question marks, you don't have to put the space, cap, none of that stuff. It already knows what to do. Once you put those brackets, it knows that it means, it knows what you want to do, and it knows the correct way of doing it. Make sense?
So
Okay.
do you have to have a different stroke for closed parentheses, or do you just do the same one because it knows it's going to come up, right?
You just do paren again. But when you define it, like say you do paren prep, and you misstroked it, but you want to define it again because you know that paren prep is, it's always the open paren,
Okay.
never the closed paren, because it's not, it's smart, but it's not smart enough to know. It knows that when you do it the first time, put the first open paren, and when you do it again, put the closed paren. It knows already. So when you define it, it's always the open paren. Make sense? Orle? Okay. Let's see what the next one is. We just did the braces.
Right.
Yeah. The prefixes and stuff, it's kind of, it'll go quick. Yeah, and it's kind of the same thing. But it'll kind of explain some stuff in depth.
Let's see how Total Eclipse handles prefixes and suffixes. Your Steno dictionary probably includes common prefixes to hook onto a following word and suffixes to hook onto a previous word. Eclipse does a great job of adjusting spellings as it adds prefixes and suffixes, but please remember, it will only adjust the spellings if braces surround both the delete space symbol and the prefix or suffix text. Eclipse will not automatically adjust spellings if only the delete space symbol is within braces. Eclipse comes with a prefixes and suffixes kit with a dictionary that includes several hundred entries. All you have to do is decide whether you want to use the steno that is given as an example, or press the enter key to get inside and change the steno to something that you know you would write. The documentation shows how these prefixes and suffixes, added to common root words, could help translate uncommon words beautifully. Much more could be said about prefixes and suffixes, but this is the subject of a separate in-depth ePower video tutorial, which shows you step by step how to take advantage of the prefixes and suffixes kit.
Okay, does that make sense? I'm gonna play it again.
Let's see how Total Eclipse handles prefixes and suffixes. Your Steno dictionary probably includes common prefixes to hook onto a following word and suffixes to hook onto a previous word.
That's what I was talking about earlier. When you're going to define it, you have to know where you put the caret, because it only knows whether it's a prefix or a suffix. Does that make sense? We'll laugh. So it already knows when you add the S to make it plural, it's already going to know whether to add ES, IES, any of that stuff. So you don't have to worry about putting IES, ES, any of that. But you have to be careful about putting the brackets in there. Quit. Because if you don't put the brackets in there, then it doesn't know what to do. The brackets tells it what to do. If you leave it outside of the brackets, then it thinks you're doing something totally different, and it's not going to do what you think it's going to do.
Eclipse does a great job of adjusting spellings as it adds prefixes and suffixes. But please remember, it will only adjust the spellings if braces surround both the delete space symbol and the prefix or suffix text. Eclipse will not automatically adjust.
And that's what it's talking about right here, guys. So if you wanted to add, all it's going to know to do is every time it puts ed, so anytime you write Edward and it's Ed word, then it's going to put the ed with the other word because that's what it's telling it to do. Does that make sense?
Right.
That makes sense? So it has to be inside the brackets for it to know that you want ed to go with the word that was right before that, because it's a suffix. And this pre goes with the other word when it's inside of the brackets with the caret, because it knows to put the word together. Does that make sense? Extremely important, guys, that you define it correctly, because it's only going to do what you tell it to do. And if you don't know how to define it correctly, then it's not going to know what to do, and it's not going to do what you think it's going to do. And then you're going to get upset because you think, you know, because you defined it incorrectly and it's doing a totally different function. Make sense?
Adjust spellings if only the delete space symbol is within braces. Eclipse comes with a prefixes and suffixes kit with a dictionary that includes several hundred entries. All you have to do is decide whether you want to use the steno that is given as an example, or press the enter key to get inside and change the steno to something that you know you would write. The documentation shows how these prefixes and suffixes, added to common root words, could help translate uncommon words beautifully. Much more could be said about prefixes and suffixes, but this is the subject of a separate in-depth ePower video tutorial which shows you step by step how to take advantage of the prefixes and suffixes kit.
That's going to happen to you. Okay, and I'm almost certain that I have that video also on the prefixes and suffixes, and we can kind of go through it because it goes in depth of telling you exactly how to go in your dictionary and defining all of this stuff.
So what is the correct way to have Mr., Mrs., Miss, and Doctor defined in your dictionary? Is it going to be Doctor period, because mine is Doctor period, and then the squiggly line, the close space squiggly, and then the delete space and squigglies. Is this the correct way?
Yes. Because it knows doctor period,
Yeah.
keep it together,
Okay.
space, and then the straight up and down means cap. Does that make sense? Okay. Because you don't want it together. You don't want it all in one bracket.
Cap next.
Is it straight up
It's a
and down?
dash and
The straight, the line, this one. That's in the toy box space in that
this means capital.
Means space.
Space or capital?
That's cap next. That's cap next.
This means capital.
This is space. Or that's,
That means there's a space in there, cap next.
okay, yeah. Something like that. It's cap next. Space. Clean that up.
Got it? Yeah, all right. Okay, so that, did y'all understand all of that? Does that make sense? But that's a symbol for, that's the correct way of doing it.
Okay.
That make sense to you?
That's why I wanted to make sure it's right, so it makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. Here they're just kind of explaining about if you want it. I think I'm almost certain that I have the video to the prefix and suffix thing, so I'll bring it. We can go into it next week. Does that make sense? Jesus Christ.
What?
Okay, here they're giving you example of unwritten steno, and what they're trying to say is this right here. And then they're going to give it to you of how it would look in steno and how it's going to come up when it's defined. Does that make sense? So if you're looking at it in the steno thing, this is what it's going to look like, and this is what it's going to get defined as. But when you define it correctly, it's going to come up. It's going to come up correctly if you define it correctly. But you don't want, I mean, you can put this in your dictionary that you want histographer, to come up. But if it's a root word to something else, then you want that, and you know that you stroke it with something else. You want to define it as a totally different stroke. Does that make sense? Yes? Okay, so you want to put them, and it'll know how to put it together and correctly spell it once you put it together. So once you define it correctly, it's going to know to put it together and correctly define it if it's a word, if it's a true word. Does that make sense? Okay. Okay, here it's kind of telling you that the caret is used to delete the space, so it knows to put it together. So anytime you put the caret in there, in the brackets with anything, it's going to know to delete the space, keep it together. So prefixes, suffixes, stuff like that, puts it together. And right here it's just kind of, giving you the example of if you're defining steno ER, and it comes after the word create, define it as ER rather than OR, and Eclipse is going to know to put it as OR. Like,
Makes sense? Yes.
yeah, makes sense?
Yes.
You can teach this class. So it already knows what to do when you put the ER on there, on the word. So if it was IER, it's going to know. If it was OR, it's going to know,
Or you can define just the R to mean ER or OR.
What's that?
The steno R, the final R, you can just define that to mean.
If that's your ER? Is that your
Yeah.
ER? Okay, yeah, then yes. Then that's what it's doing. Also right here, it gives you examples of how to do it if you have a stacking problem. So say you have the ing with the that's how you do it. Because if you put the caret ing and put the inside of the bracket, it's going to put it all together every time. Does that make sense? It's not going to define it correctly. This is the way that it needs to go in your dictionary correctly. So you want it to say that it's going to go, it's a suffix, so it's the caret, ing, brackets, and then the afterwards. There's no space in between here, because it already knows from the brackets that you put the space, add the. Make sense? Same thing right here, that S was used as a suffix with the question symbol. And that's how you do it. And I guess they were trying to stroke out US. Oh, I guess they do US twice. I guess that's how they write United States. I don't know what they were, and that looks like what they were trying to do right there. US is United States, is a symbol for United States for this person. For me, it's Yites. Yites is United States, but if you wrote yites with the question, I don't know, it's a lot of letters together. I don't know if you'd be able to read it or not. But I mean, that's what they're saying right there. If it was a stroke and it's a two-stroke and it's the same stroke, then that's how it would look. That's how it might look. It'll come up, you know, capital US with the US with the question symbol, and then that's how you need to define it. Okay? Oh, okay. And then this is kind of explaining exactly what I was telling you guys about, you know, if you wanted to write preponderance, and this is the way they write it, it's ants. So what you would do is, you know that pre is always a prefix. So you want to set it up as a prefix. You could define the whole word later, I guess, if you wanted to, but the way that Eclipse is going to know is that pre always goes as a prefix. So you set it up as a prefix, and that ER is always, you know, usually a suffix. So set it up as a suffix, and ANCE is a suffix too. So that's the way that you could define it. Or you could just global for and then just define preponderance, if you're going to stroke that out. Ridiculous if you are, but if that's the way you do it, that's just an example that they're giving you. And then here they're just kind of giving you the option of how to set it up. You know, you define it, it already knows. It's pretty sure that that's what you meant. So it gives you different options of what you want to do there. So, you know, I don't know why I don't give you why. Anyway, it gives you different options right there, and it knows, you know, this is what I think you meant. Well, you know what? It's number 3 because it was a prefix for remind. Enter, it already comes up. Okay? And, you know, again here on preponderance, you know, it gives you that option. You know, again, you define it. You know what? I want it as pre. It didn't even give you that option. See, it doesn't give you the option here. So now you have to define it. Bracket, PRE, okay, 6. Then close bracket, and then that's how you define it. Okay? Because it's used as a prefix. Make sense? So it already knows, and then you push T again, it brings you to ER. Well, you know what? I need to define it. Well, you know what? It's number 3 because I know that it's a suffix. You want it in your main, preponder, and it's already, so now you want to put yance. Well, yance may be, if that's the way you stroke ANCE for certain words. If it's not, and you're just putting it on as part of preponder yance, that's the way you hear it, that's fine. The way that they showed us in the example was that you don't, that's the way that they stroke ANCE. So we're going to do it that way just because that's the way they did it. So it's caret, ANCE, close bracket, and that's the way that they defined it, because that's the way that they always stroke ANCE. Make sense? Put it together, and it puts the word together. It already knows how to spell it and everything. Make sense? Okay. On the next one, you know, it thinks that you stacked. So it gives you that option right there. I think what you meant was judging from. So it gives you the suffix ing with from, no space after the bracket. So you choose number 3. That is what I meant. But you notice the judge is spelled correctly with the E. But look what it does. It already knows. Take the E off, add the ing. All right? I'm not going to go through all of them. All right.
Occasionally, you'll need to add a prefix or suffix while editing. You can click on a toolbar icon or click on a toolbar icon. Occasionally, you'll need to add a prefix or suffix.
I don't know why this thing does.
Occasionally, you'll need to add a prefix or suffix while editing. You can click on a toolbar icon or open the Edit menu to insert a prefix or suffix, or press Hyperkey W. At this dialog, G is a shortcut. And this time I'll use the shortcut D. And of course, these suffixes were added with the proper spelling adjustments. Much more could be said about prefixes and suffixes, but this is the subject of a separate in-depth ePower video tutorial which shows you step by step how to take advantage of the prefixes and suffixes kit.
Okay, do y'all use that? Do y'all use the endings, prefix, suffixes in the hyperkeys?
Answer your question.
You already missed the whole video.